Some places are not hidden because they are secret. They are hidden because acknowledging them would force people to take responsibility. Mount Massive Asylum was one of those places, a facility that officially existed, legally operated, and yet somehow remained unseen by the public for years. The message that exposed it did not sound urgent. There were no screams for help, no dramatic warnings. It was written calmly, almost professionally. That calmness was the first warning sign. When someone describes horror without emotion, it usually means they have lived with it for too long. Psychiatric hospitals are built on trust. Patients surrender control with the belief that authority exists to protect them. Mount Massive exploited that belief perfectly. Behind locked gates and reinforced walls, it operated under the assumption that no one was listening closely enough to ask difficult questions. The email suggested systematic abuse, experimental procedures, and violations buried beneath legal language. Nothing explicit, nothing dramatic, just enough information to suggest that something fundamental had gone wrong, the kind of wrong that does not happen overnight. What makes this story disturbing is not the promise of violence. It is the implication of routine. Forms signed, procedures repeated, decisions approved by people who went home at the end of the day, believing they were doing their jobs. Mount Massive was never presented as a place of terror. It was presented as a solution, a controlled environment designed to manage extreme cases quietly, efficiently, and without interference. This is where the danger begins, because the most horrifying systems are not chaotic. They are organized, they function smoothly, they appear reasonable until you examine the cost. The message was not a call for help, it was a confession. And once it was read, there was no way to unknow what it suggested. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. From the outside, Mount Massive appeared distant and uninviting. Surrounded by snow-covered mountains, it felt deliberately removed from civilization. Isolation was not a side effect of its location. It was a feature. The structure itself was imposing. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, architecture designed to contain rather than comfort. This was not a place meant for recovery. It was a place meant for control. Every angle, every corridor, every locked door reinforced that message. Inside, the atmosphere felt unnervingly quiet. Not peaceful, but restrained. Hallways stretched longer than expected. Lights flickered inconsistently, creating shadows that felt intentional. Doors stood partially open, suggesting recent movement but no visible presence. Hospitals usually guide people gently. Mount Massive guided them forcefully. Movement was restricted. Observation was constant. Privacy was treated as a risk rather than a right. Patients were not meant to feel safe. They were meant to feel compliant. The building itself participated in psychological pressure. Silence became overwhelming. Stillness felt aggressive. Even empty rooms carried tension, as if they were waiting to be filled again. Time behaved strangely inside the facility. Without natural light or clear routines, hours blurred together. This disorientation weakened resistance. When people lose track of time, they lose track of themselves. Mount Massive was not simply a location where experiments occurred. It was an instrument, a controlled environment designed to reshape behavior slowly, without force when possible. And once inside, the realization came quietly but unmistakably. This place was not built to heal the mind. It was built to break it carefully, methodically, and without witnesses. The patients of Mount Massive were not monsters. They were not criminals. Most were individuals society did not know how to handle. People with trauma, instability, or conditions that made them inconvenient rather than dangerous. Inside the facility, identity disappeared quickly. Names were replaced by numbers. Personal history was reduced to symptoms. Emotional responses were categorized, measured, and judged against expectations rather than needs. Treatment focused on compliance. Improvement was defined as obedience. Silence was interpreted as progress. Resistance was labeled aggression. The more a patient struggled, the more justification existed to push further. What made the situation especially disturbing was how suffering was reframed. Pain was described as temporary. Fear was described as necessary. Breakdown was described as a step forward. Language softened reality until cruelty no longer sounded cruel. Patients were told they were improving even as they deteriorated. Trust was exploited repeatedly. Dependence was encouraged. Escape became psychologically impossible long before it became physically restricted. Over time, many patients stopped trusting their own perception. When authority consistently denies your experience, doubt replaces certainty. Once that doubt takes hold, control becomes effortless. Mount Massive did not destroy its patients quickly. It dismantled them slowly, piece by piece, teaching them to question their instincts, their memories, and their reality. By the time the damage became visible, it was already irreversible. And inside Mount Massive, irreversible was considered acceptable. The doctors of Mount Massive did not see themselves as villains. That is what makes their roles so unsettling. They believed they were innovators, professionals operating at the edge of scientific progress. Their language was clinical and precise. Charts replaced faces, data replaced stories. Patients were discussed as cases, not people. Emotional distance was framed as professionalism. Ethical concerns were never dismissed openly. They were acknowledged, documented, and postponed. There was always another phase, another test, another justification for continuing. Stopping would mean admitting failure, and failure was unacceptable. Over time, empathy eroded quietly, not through hatred, but through repetition. When suffering becomes routine, it loses urgency. When pain is expected, it stops functioning as a warning. Authority protected them. Funding validated them. Results silenced doubt. Those who questioned the process were reassigned, ignored, or removed entirely. Inside Mount Massive, obedience was rewarded far more than conscience. The doctors did not lose control because they were reckless. They lost control because intelligence was allowed to operate without restraint. Knowledge without accountability becomes something colder than cruelty. Mount Massive did not collapse because of madness. It collapsed because rational people convinced themselves that responsibility could wait. And once responsibility is delayed long enough, it disappears entirely. The experiments at Mount Massive were not sudden acts of cruelty. They were gradual escalations, each phase pushed slightly further than the last, justified by previous results. What began as observation slowly transformed into intervention, and intervention became manipulation. Patients were exposed to extreme psychological stress, under the belief that fear could be reshaped into control. Sleep deprivation, sensory overload, isolation. These methods were not hidden. They were documented carefully, described in neutral language that stripped them of emotional weight. The goal was not healing. It was predictability. Doctors wanted to map reactions to understand how far the human mind could bend before it broke. When it broke, the failure was blamed on the patient, not the process. Consent became meaningless. Patients were told participation was necessary. Resistance was interpreted as proof that treatment was working. The more someone suffered, the more valuable their response became. What made the experiments truly disturbing was their structure. Nothing felt chaotic. Schedules were followed, data was logged. The system functioned smoothly even as human lives unraveled inside it. Mount Massive did not cross ethical lines accidentally. It stepped over them slowly, one justification at a time, until the lines no longer existed at all. The Walrider was never meant to exist as it did. It was not planned as a presence or an entity. It emerged from the experiments as an unintended result, shaped by belief, fear, and repeated exposure to trauma. Patients began to describe it before the doctors could define it. A sense of being watched, a force that responded to fear itself. The more attention it received, the stronger it felt. The more it was acknowledged, the more real it became. The doctors attempted to control it through classification. They tried to measure it, to name it, to contain it within language. But the Walrider did not obey structure. It existed in perception, not in form. Once fear became shared, it multiplied. The Walrider spread not through physical space, but through understanding. Those who believed in it behaved differently. Their actions reinforced its presence. Mount Massive underestimated the power of ideas. You cannot restrain something that lives inside interpretation. The Walrider did not need walls or locks. It needed attention. It was not a monster created by madness. It was a consequence of obsession and proof that control has limits. Eventually, Mount Massive could no longer maintain the illusion of control. Systems designed to contain chaos became overwhelmed by it. Patients resisted. Staff disappeared. Order fractured quietly before it shattered completely. What failed first was not security, but confidence. Procedures stopped being followed precisely. Decisions were made too quickly or too late. Once doubt entered the system, it spread rapidly. The doctors lost authority over what they had created. Experiments continued without direction. Fear replaced structure. The environment that once enforced obedience now amplified instability. Mount Massive did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled, piece by piece, room by room. Each failure exposed another weakness the system was never designed to handle. What remained was not madness, but consequence. A facility filled with evidence of decisions that could no longer be undone. The collapse was not surprising. It was inevitable. A system built without accountability cannot sustain itself forever. The real horror of Mount Massive is not confined to its walls. Even after the facility fell silent, its impact remained. Trauma does not disappear when a place is abandoned. It moves inward. Those who escaped did not leave untouched. Memory carried the weight of what was witnessed. Sounds returned unexpectedly. Silence felt threatening. The mind replayed corridors long after they were gone. Mount Massive became more than a location. It became a reminder of what happens when authority operates without restraint, when intelligence is separated from responsibility. This story lingers because it feels possible, because nothing about Mount Massive required monsters or supernatural forces. It required structure, obedience, and the willingness to look away. The asylum was not an anomaly, it was a pattern, and patterns repeat wherever power is allowed to function without accountability. That is the real horror.